Hey y'all, Eric here with another LGBT history moment. And this is day 22 of the month of October, which is LGBT History Month. Today I'm spotlighting a figure in history which I didn't know too much about at all until, even though my family was involved in the civil rights movement during the 50s and 60s, and I knew about that when I was growing up, but I didn't know the role that Bayard Rustin, his role in all of that until I was in college in the late 1980s. And I was born in the 1960s. And so let's dive in and talk a little bit about what we all know about Bayard and some of the things that I learned that I didn't previously know. And I have a picture of him. And so there we go. This is Bayard Rustin right here. And he's in the picture. The caption even talks about it. This is Philip Randolph, who played a prominent role in Bayard's life. And that's one of the things, too, where I had always called him Bayard Rustin until I heard former President Barack Obama call him Bayard Rustin. And so unless I didn't know him personally or hear anyone who knew about him, I'm stuck with Bayard, and I will issue an apology right at the top of this video for mispronouncing his name, if in fact it is Bayard. Because even though I try to say Bayard, it just doesn't come out. All right, so Bayard Rustin was born in 1912, and he died in 1987. He was an American political activist and prominent leader in social movements for civil rights, socialism, nonviolence, and gay rights. Rustin was the principal organizer on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. Now, most of us do know, and credit is given to Bayard as the organizer of that march. But how he got there and the troubles that he had to deal with are mainly unknown. Part of his upbringing, Bayard was born to Florence and Archie, who were unmarried. And as Florence was a single mother, Rustin was raised by his maternal grandparents, Julia and Jennifer Rustin, wealthy local caterers, as the ninth of their 12 children. And growing up, he believed his biological mother was his older sister. His grandmother was a Quaker, although she attended her husband's African American Episcopal, or what we know today as one of the major churches for black people to go to, the AME church. She was also a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. NAACP leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson were frequent guests in the Rustin home. With these influences in his early life, in his youth, Rustin campaigned against racial discriminatory Jim Crow laws. And so, like me, activism and civil rights was in his blood. He actually went to an historically black college that I had never heard of. In 1932, he entered Wilberforce University, a historically black college in Ohio operated by the AME Church. He was active in a number of campus organizations, including the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. He was expelled from Wilberforce in 1936 after organizing a strike, and he later attended Cheyney State Teachers College, now known today as Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. Cheyney actually honored Rustin with a posthumous Doctorate of Humane Letters degree at its 2013 commencement. So let's fast forward to the March on Washington. Now, previously, in the picture that I showed you, about A. Philip Randolph. Randolph was instrumental in getting him involved in the civil rights movement. And he had previously helped A. Philip Randolph with organizing a march 20 years before the March on Washington, on the Civil Rights March on Washington, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. And they gained an audience with the president, and the president issued an executive order talking about desegregating the employment practices of the federal government and federal agencies. And he did that. And so, to show their good faith, they decided to cancel the march because the president actually did what he said he was going to do. But that was done, the cancellation of the march was done against Bayard's advice. And the reason that Rustin was against it was because the military, which is a federal agency, was still segregated until Harry S. Truman became president, and he issued an executive order desegregating the military ranks. I believe that was in 1948. And so throughout his life, Bayard never forgot his mother's Quakerism. He had traveled to India, and he appreciated Mahatma Gandhi's life to lead protests through nonviolence, and that was the legacy that he left. He was a member of the Communist Party in the USA, but he later left the Communist Party. He was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. And one other thing that I discovered about Bayard is that he was an accomplished tenor singer and actually performed on Broadway. After the March on Washington, and of course we know the stories that members of the organizers who were around King, and when I say King, I mean Martin Luther King Jr., advised King not to put Bayard Rustin as the head of the march, or directing the march. So they named A. Philip Randolph, as the director of the march, and named Bayard as his deputy assistant, even though Bayard did all the work and ran the march, all because Bayard was openly gay. And they knew he was gay. And yet they thought that if he were the head of it, the director of it, openly named the director of it, it would diminish the credibility of the march. And therein lies my problem with the church, because most of the people who were against Bayard were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and there were many people who were involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who were against King hiring Bayard Rustin to help run the SCLC because he was gay. King didn't have a problem with it, but the other ones did. And so therein lies the divide between black gay people and the church that has saved us all since the days of slavery. But I digress. That's a conversation for another day. After the march, Bayard was essentially dismissed by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so he involved himself in other things. got into politics more so. But here's an interesting piece that I found regarding something that happened a few weeks before the march. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond railed against Rustin as a communist, draft dodger, and homosexual, and had his entire Pasadena arrest file entered into the record. Thurmond also produced a Federal Bureau of Investigation photograph of Rustin talking to King while King was bathing to imply that there was a same-sex relationship between the two, which both men denied. And I can confidently say, based on readings and history, there was nothing like that went on between Rustin and King. I mean, even if we suppose that there was something between them, so what? It's about their work. It's about their work. But I'm not going to disrespect the King family by even entertaining that. And so he was involved in the New York City school boycott in 1964. And then he left protests and got into politics. He was involved in the 1964 National Democratic Convention, the Democratic National Convention, and became an advisor to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And they were trying to gain recognition as the legitimate non-Jim Crow delegation from their state, where blacks had been officially disenfranchised since the turn of the century, as they were generally throughout the South. Does that sound familiar about what's happening today, i.e. Texas and now North Carolina? After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Rustin advocated closer ties between the civil rights movement and the Democratic Party, specifically the party's base among the white working class, many of whom still had strong union affiliations. With Tom Kahn, Rustin wrote an influential article in 1964 called From Protest to Politics, published in Commentary magazine. It analyzed the changing economy and its implications for African Americans. Rustin wrote persistently that the rise of automation would reduce the demand for low-skilled, high-paying jobs, which would jeopardize the position of the urban African American working class, particularly in northern states. He believed that the working class had to collaborate across racial lines for common economic goals. His prophecy has been proven right in the dislocation and loss of jobs for many urban African Americans due to restructuring of the industries in the coming decades. Rustin believed that the African American community needed to change its political strategy, building and strengthening a political alliance with predominantly white unions and other organizations such as churches and synagogues to pursue a common economic agenda. He wrote that it was time to move from protest to politics. Rustin's analysis of the economic problems of the black community was widely influential. And so a member of our community, ostracized for who he was and how he lived, was instrumental in the bringing about of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Bayard Rustin, and that same Civil Rights Act is under attack, along with the Voting Rights Act. So today, I salute Bayard Rustin. Rest in power, Byron. And I end this video as I always do. Hashtag elections have consequences, and resistance is not futile. See you on the next one.